speaker is Christina Oguz, who is going to be speaking from an international perspective. Christina is the president of the European Union Council on Horizontal Drugs and a leader in this effort, head of the UNODC Afghan program in 2007-2008, frequently been the Swedish delegate to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and one of the world's leaders in understanding drug abuse and social policy, particularly from an international perspective. We're very proud to have her here with us today.
Well, I'm not Raymond, as you can see. Unfortunately, he was taken ill and couldn't come. And I'm also not the president of the Horizontal Drugs Group. I was during the Swedish presidencies in 2001 and 2009. The rest is more or less correct. Yes, very close. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to, I think we've listened to two very, very interesting, can I put this down? Because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. We've listened to two very, very interesting talks, I think. And I'm going to talk about what the International Drug Control Conventions say about marijuana as medicine. So I'm going to speak from a purely legal point of view, from an international legal point of view. I would like to start off by reminding us why the conventions talk about drugs in the way they do. Is because the fathers and the mothers of the drug control conventions were concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. And this is actually how the 1961 convention starts, concerned with the health and welfare of mankind. And there are two main reasons why we have internationally agreed conventions to control narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Firstly, because, and now I'm quoting from the 1961 convention, the medical use of narcotic drugs continues to be indispensable for the relief of pain and suffering, and adequate provisions must be made to ensure the availability of narcotic drugs for such purposes. So that's one side of it. The other side is because, and I quote again, addiction to narcotic drugs constitutes a serious evil for the individual and is fraught with social and economic danger to mankind. So you will find the same concerns with regard to psychotropic substances which are regulated in the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances. In other words, the role of the conventions is to limit drug use to medical and scientific use. And we've heard a lot about how these substances act on the brain, and we know that narcotic drugs such as morphine, which are so much needed for the treatment of pain, and benzodiazepines, which you are familiar with also, which are used for their tranquilizing and anti-anxiety effect, they are not only beneficial, they are also dangerous, and they may cause addiction, they may cause serious side effects, and even death if they are not administered in the right way. So therefore, the use, the prescription, the manufacture, etc., are hedged in by a number of control mechanisms to be applied universally as a minimum. And the same pertains to their raw materials, such as opium. I mentioned opium because it's universally recognized as raw material for the production of a number of medical drugs. Opium itself is not internationally recognized as a medical drug, although it is used as such in some parts of the world, for example in Afghanistan, in remote areas where people don't have access to doctors and medicine. So if a state considers that there is a need to cultivate opium poppy for medical purposes, France and India are examples of countries cultivating opium as raw material for medicine, it must set up a national agency. And this agency shall designate the areas and the plots of land on which the cultivation of opium for the purpose of producing, the cultivation of opium poppy for the purpose of producing opium shall be permitted. It shall give a license to the cultivators and make sure that only those with a license grow opium poppy. They shall specify the extent of the land on which the cultivation is permitted in each individual case. They shall make sure that the licensed growers deliver their total crop to the agency. So the agency shall have the exclusive right of importing, exporting, wholesale training and maintaining stocks of opium. And so why do I talk about opium when this is about cannabis? I do it for the simple reason because exactly the same rules and regulations pertain to cannabis as to opium. If a state permits the cultivation of cannabis, it must apply exactly the same control system. It must set up a national cannabis agency. And cannabis is included not only in Schedule 1 but also in Schedule 4 of the 1961 Convention, which requires the most stringent control measures. For a drug to be included in Schedule 4, it has to be considered particularly liable to abuse and to produce ill effects, and I'm quoting again, and such liability should not be offset by substantial therapeutic advantages. And this was found applicable to cannabis in 1961. And parties to the 1961 Convention, like the United States, like Sweden, are required to limit exclusively to medical and scientific purposes the production, etc., even the use and the possession of cannabis, limited only to medical and scientific purposes. And those countries which had a traditional use of cannabis when the 1961 Convention entered into force or was ratified, they were allowed a 25-year moratorium to phase out the use of cannabis for other purposes than medical and scientific. And we've seen that in the last decades that cannabis has increased enormously, in particular in countries where it was not used at all as a traditional drug. And today it is the most widely used cannabis in the world, and it is affecting practically every country across the globe. We have heard about the United States and the way they deal with cannabis as a medicine there, but there is to date no international recognition of the medical benefits of the use of cannabis as such, but there are, as we've heard, medicines containing THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis, and marinol is such a medicine. And I found it quite interesting to hear that there are more than 400 different chemicals, including most of the hazardous chemicals found in tobacco smoke in cannabis, as compared to marinol, where there is nothing of this. And as far as I know, there is nowhere in the world there is any approved medication that is smoked. I haven't heard of any anyhow. When preparing for this, when I was asked if I could step in for Raymond, I of course studied the conventions, which I was familiar with before, but I also went through the 9 last annual reports of the International Narcotics Control Board, which is the agency within the UN system, which is the watchdog of the conventions. And they reported that the most comprehensive, scientifically rigorous review of studies of smoked marijuana was conducted by the Institute of Medicine in the United States, and this report was released in 1999. And as we've heard, they did not recommend the use of smoked marijuana, but they did conclude that the active ingredient could be isolated and developed into a variety of pharmaceuticals. It also stated that the plants contained a variable variable mixture of biologically active compounds, and it could not be expected to provide a precisely defined drug effect. And the International Narcotics Control Board noted this in its annual report in 2000. And based on this, they encouraged further scientific research into the possible medical use of cannabis. And since then, they have repeatedly, almost every year, come back to this question and repeated the encouragement to do this kind of scientific research. And not only have they done that, they have also called upon governments not to allow the medical use of cannabis unless conclusive results of research are available. And in spite of this, medical use of cannabis was authorized in Canada in 2001 and in the Netherlands in 2003, where it is sold as a prescription drug in pharmacies, not as we heard from the United States, but in pharmacies. We've also heard, I can cut some of what I was going to say because we listened to it before, that there are several states in the United States that have enacted laws that provide for the medical use of cannabis. And according to the latest annual report of ISB, the 2009 report, which was released in February this year, the control measures applied in those states for the cultivation of cannabis plants and the production, distribution and use of cannabis fall short of the control requirements laid down in the 1961 Convention. The board writes that it is deeply concerned that those insufficient control provisions have contributed substantially to the increase in illicit cultivation and abuse of cannabis in the United States. When a country wants to cultivate or import raw materials such as opium or cannabis or even heroin for scientific purposes, it has to furnish the ISB with estimates. And based on this, the ISB is aware of several countries including Canada, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, the United Kingdom and the United States, which are planning or carrying out scientific research on the efficacy of medical use of cannabis in the treatment of AIDS wasting, glaucoma, multiple sclerosis, and pain, and in alleviating the side effects of cancer chemotherapy. So far I have not seen the results of these studies, and to my knowledge there is yet no conclusive evidence of the medical benefits of smoking cannabis as compared to the benefits of a medicine such as marinol. Some of the governments that allow the cultivation of cannabis plant for the production of cannabis to be used in scientific research, they do not yet apply the control requirements set by the provisions of the 1961 Convention. And from what I heard today about how it's used in the United States, this is against the conventions actually. And because the Convention requires the establishment of a national cannabis agency with the exclusive right of licensing the cultivation of importing, exporting, etc., etc. And these treaty provisions must always be implemented, even if cannabis is produced for research purposes only. To conclude, narcotic drugs must be used, manufactured, sold, etc., only for medical or scientific purposes, and this includes cannabis, which is under the same control as heroin, Schedule 4. So far, there is no conclusive scientific evidence indicating the benefit of smoked cannabis over the oral intake of medicine containing THC, which is the active ingredient of cannabis. And the International Narcotics Control Board actually encourages scientific research and reminds governments that if they want to do such research, they will have to establish a national cannabis agency with the exclusive right to license the cultivation of cannabis or importation and maintaining the stocks even. They have to, the crop has to be given over to the national agency. And It's very clear from what the conventions say that one cannot choose one's own control regime. The conventions recognize that effective measures against drug abuse require universal rules and actions. It means that the same kind of controls must be applied on the whole territory. To turn a blind eye to domestic cultivation of marijuana for household requirements, or to even allow it, as we heard in some of the states, is not okay according to the conventions. It's against. It should not happen, because there are ways to do this in line with the conventions. And that is to set up a national cannabis agency with the exclusive right to decide where, by whom, how much, on which area, etc. you can cultivate cannabis. And the cultivators have to deliver that cannabis to the national agency, which in turn then will distribute it. So it's, as far as I can understand, it's very, very clear what the conventions say. The conventions are not against the medical use of marijuana if it can be proven that it is effective as such, but it has to be done under certain conditions, and these conditions are not fulfilled in most of the countries. There are, I think, only Switzerland, as far as I'm aware, which has set up a national cannabis agency. I might be wrong there, but the United States definitely doesn't. They don't have it. Thank you very much.